and welcome back to Mountain Minds Monday. We're at the main part of the event with our speaker, but first, before we do that, I want to do a huge thank you to all of the sponsors and community partners that make this happen. So we have our gold sponsor, Holland and Hart, and I have Dick here from Holland and Hart who will tell us a little bit about them.
Okay, well, Holland and Hart is a large law firm. We're the largest in Nevada and in Colorado, and one of the largest in Utah. We have smaller offices in all the other Rocky Mountain states and in Washington. We're a full-service firm. I'm in the patents group, and like I said before, what I do is patents and copyrights and trademarks, where we'd be glad to talk with you for most any of your legal needs.
Thank you, Dick, and thank you to Holland and Hart. So for our silver sponsors, we've got Heads Up Health, and we have David here to tell us a little bit about Heads Up Health.
Hi everyone, my name is Dave Korsunski. I'm a former Truckee resident, and I've created a software platform called Heads Up Health, and it allows individuals to very prescriptively start to measure and track their health so we can understand how different lifestyle choices are affecting overall health, disease markers, and other health-related topics. So at the back of the room here, we have a bunch of the latest and greatest health tracking technology that you can come check out. The Oura Ring, we've got some of the PEMF devices, we've got something called a Brain Tap, we've got the Keto Mojo glucose ketone meter. So if you want to come check out some of the latest gear and check out our software, we'll be at the back of the room after John's talk. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, David, and I do highly recommend that everybody stops in. It was a very popular spot last time David was here sponsoring. So for our silver sponsors, we also want to thank Mobo Law. So they have offices in Truckee, Reno, Sacramento, and Incline Village, and they represent clients in business law, construction law, estate planning, family law, intellectual property, real estate law, and bankruptcy. Another silver sponsor, we have the Lake Tahoe Wellness Center. So they're over in Kings Beach. They offer services to help you achieve your wellness, including chiropractic, acupuncture, active release therapy, massage, infrared sauna, yoga and Tai Chi classes, and an indoor climbing wall with a full herbal pharmacy as well. We also have a whole lot of community partners here. So we have, the Nevada County Tech Connection, TTC TV. So we've got Dan over there working the live stream. The Truckee Tahoe Airport, the Lyft Cowork, you all met Jan earlier. And the Truckee Chamber of Commerce, of course, our venue here, Pizza on the Hill, the Truckee Roundhouse, and then also, I don't have them up here, but I'll be adding it. DLL, they're doing our laptop maintenance for us today. So a huge thank you to all our sponsors and community partners for making this possible. If you're wondering, how do I become one of those and get on that list, I've got a link for you. You can also email or just come up and ask me. I'm happy to chat with you. And now on to individual sponsors. So we just talked about the corporate sponsors. So somebody probably asked you on the way in if you were an individual sponsor. What this is, you pay $150. That's for the entire year. It gets you entry to all the Mountain Minds Monday events. You get pizza and salad each time. You also get a special drink ticket that gets you one alcoholic beverage or 2 sodas. And you probably noticed you get your own special line, so you don't have to wait in line to check in. It's actually a really good deal. I think right now our cost for attendance is something like $15, but this comes out to $12.50, plus includes the beer or wine that you wouldn't normally get. So I have a link here for you. You could also talk to me. So now for our main event, our topic tonight is biohacking. Finding your way to better health and productivity. And I'm just really excited to have Dr. John Limansky here. And so I'm going to read you his bio. If you want to come on up, John. So Dr. John Limansky is a board-certified physician in internal medicine. He has worked as a hospital medicine physician for a decade and saw firsthand the destruction caused by a modern Western diet and lifestyle. His desire to improve health and longevity for his patients and society led him to creating his own virtual practice. Dr. Limansky incorporates biohacking techniques within a ketogenic lifestyle to improve health at a cellular level. He currently is the co-host of the Keto Hacking MD podcast with veteran podcaster Jimmy Moore. So I'm very excited to introduce John to all of you. Thanks for being here, John.
Okay. And you want me to hold that as well?
No,
Or just
you're all
for-
my.
okay.
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you to Rachel and Garrett for putting this together. This talk is very informal, so feel free to interrupt me if you have questions or if you want me to expand on the topic. I hope everybody finished their pizza before we start talking about keto. No judging here. Yeah, no judging. What am I doing wrong? That's the talk. Yeah. Garrett. It's just going to the end of the slide. Oh, that's probably why. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So for today's discussion, because it's also a group of entrepreneurs and business individuals, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the cost of doing business as far as healthcare is related. Healthcare on a national level is becoming something that we're talking about quite a bit. I promise this will not be a political talk. I don't know if you're like me, but I'm tired of politics. So, but regardless of whether or not you are into politics or don't really care, it's a big point of contention because we're spending so much money on healthcare, and maybe we can prevent that by doing more preventative care. So just for complete transparency, I run a company called Biohacking MD, which basically allows for information on biohacking and ketosis. You met Dave earlier, who's the founder of Heads Up Health. I'm the chief medical officer. And as Rachel mentioned, I run a virtual medical office. So let's talk a little bit about cost of doing business, where we are as a nation as far as the cost. So we spend about $3.5 trillion a year for healthcare related costs. And that number, I'm sure some of the physicians in this room can attest, is just going to continue rising because we're not really addressing the root cause of a lot of these diseases. We're doing what I call sick care, which is basically a Band-Aid approach. So Warren Buffett, famous investor, states that healthcare really acts like an economic tapeworm. So we use it as part of our GDP, but it's really a detriment to a lot of businesses. And this is a little bit old, but the World Economic Forum showed really the cost of healthcare, and this is 2013, as a percentage of GDP. And you can see us at the end in the United States, our percentage, which is actually much higher now, is about 21%. And our life expectancy is not as great as a lot of other individualized or industrialized nations. And so what are we actually spending all this money for? Are we getting healthier? Are we getting sicker? So again, I promise this wouldn't be political, but we were told that the affordable health care or Obamacare would really tamp down on costs. And there's many reasons why this didn't really happen, but you can see that even when it really was enacted, all the costs went exponentially. And it's not because of the act, but the act itself didn't really do much to tamp down the cost of healthcare. And so from a total perspective, we are just exponentially increasing. Part of that is due to how sick we are as a society, but also our aging population. And then from that, you can see that where are we actually spending this money? So hospital obviously is a big percentage. Our physicians are getting paid. And then we've been talking a little bit recently about drug prices and why, as a nation, our drug prices are much higher than other industrialized nations. And so what can we do about that? But not just as a society, but also individuals. So whether or not you have your own health insurance or if you're getting it through a plan, the cost, especially as far as deductibles go, continues to rise. And so even though we're talking about a universal health care, Medicare for all, or trying to tap down on costs, these prices just keep going up exponentially. And so let's say you are at the age where you're about to retire, and it's a little bit blurry, sorry for that. But what can you expect the cost for you during your retirement? And that number keeps expanding as well. So it's projected in last year and next year about $280,000 per year per retiree. And so the question then becomes, what can we do about this? Is this sick care or health care that we're practicing? And so where does the money actually go? And so for every dollar spent, and this is from RAND Corporation, but it breaks down where does the money go. So we talked about prescription drugs, so about 23% or 23 cents on the dollar goes to prescription drugs. The doctor services are also about 22%, so thank you for that. But also a lot of it is due to office and clinic visits and hospital stays. The rest, administration is very little. They do make a profit for the most part, and then you have ancillary kind of costs. But the bulk of the expenditure from a healthcare perspective is really these four things. So prescription drugs, doctor services, and that's in the hospital and the clinic visits, and then your time in the hospital. And if you look at, as our society is getting older, but also not just from our elderly, but our younger population, and it's exciting to see some high school students here maybe focusing on preventing health issues down the road. So if you look at our population, 40% had no chronic illnesses. But a big percentage actually have quite a few chronic medical illnesses. So 60% have at least one. And as you go up, 42 had more than one, and about 12% of the U.S. population has at least 5 chronic medical conditions or more. And so what are these chronic illnesses that we really see as practitioners? Well, hypertension is by far the most common one that we see. As a ketogenic person, low-carb person, lipid disorders, it's a high number. I don't necessarily believe that most of those are related, but still shows up as far as chronic illnesses go. And then other things like mood disorder, diabetes, which we'll talk about, anxiety disorders, chronic illnesses, arthritis, et cetera, and cardiovascular disease at a much lower rate. But based on the study, they look at these two risk factors as contributing significantly to cardiovascular disease. And so if you break it down even more, so remember, 40% of the population has no chronic medical illnesses, and they account for about 10% of the total expenditure from a healthcare perspective. As you go up in terms of the number of chronic medical illnesses, that percentage is much higher. Top 12%, which are the people who have 5 or more chronic medical illnesses, account for 41% of the total cost. And if you take these two categories, so 3 to 4 plus the 5, you're almost at close to 70% of all the costs are related to those two categories. And again, if you look back at what are these chronic illnesses and are these things preventable, or are these diseases that we can actually change based on diet and lifestyle modification? So I would make the argument that hypertension is one that we can significantly impact. Diabetes, Garrett mentioned he works with Verda, and they're doing a great job in trying to improve diabetes. What's not on this list is prediabetes or insulin resistance, which is also a main trigger for a lot of these chronic medical illnesses, and really should be listed as part of these chronic illnesses, because that number, if we go back to the number of people with chronic conditions, if we added that insulin resistance or prediabetes, the percentage would be significantly higher. So we have about 120 million people in the United States who have prediabetes at this point. And so why is it important to really focus on preventing health issues before they become something that's a chronic disease? And so everything that I'm going to talk about tonight is really something that is a normal physiological process that our body does in order for us to survive as a species, but we have basically created this situation where we are always in the same acute inflamed state. And so acute inflammation is things that you would expect. So if you hurt your leg, it swells up, that's your body's reaction to try to improve that. If you go out and you get allergies, that's a normal consequence. But it's really this chronic inflammation, which we think is being driven by chronically elevated insulin and glucose levels, which is driving a lot of these chronic medical diseases that we're seeing. So cardiovascular disease, our understanding has significantly changed in the last 10 years. It's obviously a point of contention. Some doctors would say that this is still a lipid disease. Others would say it's really a chronically elevated insulin plus lipid pathology. But all the other things that we see as a society which are increasing, things like cancer, which from a society perspective is increasing significantly, are due to dietary and lifestyle ways of eating and living. So if you're running a business, what is really the effect on productivity? And this is something that I think is pretty staggering. So this is from 2017. So per year, from a productivity standpoint, we lose about $530 billion due to illnesses at work or being away from work due to workman's comp illnesses or worsening performance. And in terms of lost productivity for leave, we lose about 500 million days worth of workers' productivity just based on leave. As far as impaired performance, meaning you're at work but you don't feel great, you're sick, you're not really performing at a peak level, it's about 830 million days worth of lost productivity. And per year, it's about 1.5 billion days of lost or absent employees. So it takes a big toll, and this is really from chronic illnesses. And if you put it into the context, this cost is more than the revenue of these big companies. And when I first saw that, I thought that must be an error. But the cost as a society is significant, especially when it comes to business and performance. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a ketogenic lifestyle, but I want to approach it from a different perspective. I'm sure many people here know about keto or low carb. It's become very popular. How many people practice it? You're not on camera, so don't worry. Okay. And so the way I want to approach it, and feel free to stop me if you have questions, is from a little different perspective. Most people think of keto or low carb as it's the latest and greatest weight loss fad diet, which it technically is, but it's also a lot more powerful than that. But I will be the first person to say that you don't necessarily have to be on a ketogenic diet in order to be healthy. So there's a big controversy. Does everybody need to be on keto? Can they do well with low carb or paleo or one of the other ones? I would say the most important thing is to eat real food. And so if you start with that basis as your premise, if you have metabolic issues, then maybe going a little bit more stringent in terms of low carb and keto would be the way to go. So when people hear keto, they think this, what's the fattiest thing I can eat? Deep fried, cheese, meat. As long as there's no carbs, it's keto and it's got to be healthy. And unfortunately, as keto becomes extremely popular, a lot of fast food places are saying they have keto options. And so I call this dirty keto, which is basically your ability to eat whatever you want as long as you throw away the bun. And unfortunately, that might work for a short period of time, but it's not going to be the healthiest way of practicing this. Keto reality is really, something that balances healthy fats. I grew up in a time where fat phobia was rampant, and you should never eat fat. I think the paradigm is changing. There's still contention about saturated fat, but I think at least more physicians are saying fat is not necessarily evil. But you don't have to eat something that's just fried and bacon, all that, with butter on top in order to be ketogenic. So I would really focus on healthier options. I want to talk about the impact of keto in three really main categories. So suppression of insulin, the burning of your own fat, and reduction of inflammation. And so let's start off with suppression of insulin. And I want to talk a little bit about our way of diagnosing individuals now as far as diabetes. And so on this chart, you'll see onset of diabetes here. This is where you actually, hemoglobin A1C is high enough and so you're diagnosed as a diabetic. Now, what I want you to really focus on, though, is this is 15 years before that diagnosis and what's actually happening. So your insulin level is going up significantly, and this is relative to the function. So 100 is assuming normal, and it can actually double up to like 10 or 15 years prior to your diagnosis of diabetes. So we use a measure, hemoglobin A1C, to basically say you are pre-diabetic or diabetic, and yet we're missing a big section of time where you're having significant damage to microvascular and macrovascular disease before we're actually catching it. And so what's actually happening is, as let's say you're eating a Western diet and your glucose goes up, well, your body responds by making insulin, and it responds that way until it basically cannot make enough insulin to keep up with the demand. And so you'll start seeing insulin rise. Eventually, your pancreas cannot make enough insulin, or you're not insulin sensitive and you get insulin resistance, and then your glucose will start rising. And so while during this 10-year period, your glucose is really not rising, especially your fasting glucose, eventually you get to a point where insulin is not working effectively, your muscles and your liver are overloaded with glycogen, and your glucose level starts rising significantly. And so the point I wanted to really make is that you have about a 10 to 15 year lag before you may be diagnosed with diabetes, and yet damage is being done. So it's very important to really focus on improving this, before you get a diagnosis. The best test would be, so you have to look at these tests as far as a society, it's the best test because it's going to at least capture a big portion of the population. But it's not sensitive enough where it's going to capture people who may, for 10 years, have rising insulin, but the glucose is relatively stable because the insulin is taking effect. And so if you are extremely important or thinking about how can I improve my health before I get to that diagnosis, you would be doing something like a fasting insulin C-peptide lab draw, which has its own issues because it's not 100% accurate, but at least it will give you an idea before. And so if we look at the role of insulin, and it has many roles, but the main ones I'd like to focus on are glucose, fat, hormonal impact, and then inflammation. So let's start off with glucose a little bit. So insulin, is something that now is getting a bad rap in terms of it's very dangerous, but insulin is life-saving. If you didn't have insulin, you would look like this, and then after insulin, you would look like that. The problem is that as a society, we're focusing on treating glucose instead of treating insulin. So people who obviously cannot make their own insulin, it's a life-saving property. For the rest of us, we can make enough insulin, and yet we're not really focusing on the root issue of measuring glucose. And so what is the expected response to food? Well, so this is basically insulin response here, and these are the different macronutrients. So carbohydrate will give you a significantly elevated insulin response, and that varies per individual, and it also varies based on the carbohydrate content, but just for kind of general purposes, carbohydrate's going to give you a pretty good insulin response. Protein can, and there's certain proteins that are going to be more insulinogenic, especially if you like your protein shake with your whey powder. That's probably going to give you a higher insulin response. And then fat, for all intents and purposes, will give you an insulin response. It's not going to be as high as the other ones, but in the ketogenic community, people will say I can eat as much fat as I want because it's not going to raise my insulin. That is inaccurate. Yeah, you can get an insulin response. So you're talking about like, you can still get an insulin response. And there's a difference though with hard liquor. It's not going to give you as much as something like beer, but you can still have somewhat. That's carb based, right? Yep. But the other issue too with alcohol per se is that you have to clear it before you clear anything else. So if your goal is to try to be in ketosis and actually, burning your own fat, if you drink alcohol, that basically shuts down that process until you clear the alcohol. And so why is this insulin important? So let's say you go and you have a meal and you have an insulin response, that's not a problem. That's a normal physiological process. it's this constant overindulgence in carbohydrates. And again, I use a very generic term of carbohydrates. We could break it down into more specific macronutrients, but eating carbs over a certain threshold that varies between individuals is really what drives this whole insulin resistance paradigm, where you need more insulin to balance the carbs, so you release more, but then your body becomes less sensitive to insulin, and so you need more to balance the carbohydrates. And the answer really is pretty simple. It's getting rid of the carbohydrates and doing things which include biohacking to improve on the insulin resistance. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And so this has actually been studied. Can you improve your insulin levels by being on a ketogenic diet? And so this is from the Archives of Internal Medicine 2010, and what they did is they put groups on different dietary platforms. So one did a low fat and one did a ketogenic, and this was for a 16-week period. And they looked at what is the difference in insulin concentration. And so those on a low-fat diet had a decrease in their insulin to about 2.4. On the ketogenic diet, they had a much lower, or much greater change in terms of their insulin. So their insulin dropped much lower than before, which makes sense because you're reducing the carbohydrates. If you go back to the chart where it shows what's the insulin response to a certain macronutrient, you're going to have a much lower overall insulin spike. So by suppressing insulin, you're really allowing your body to burn its own fat. And let's look at how that is. So most people would say, well, if you're eating fat, you're going to get fat, and it doesn't make sense. And this is probably one of the more important charts if you're trying to conceptualize keto, because each one of us has a threshold at which our insulin will be turned on. And so this is basically fat breakdown over time with insulin. So as your insulin is higher, you're going to be breaking down less fat. At the point at which most of us will start burning fat really varies. And that variance depends on our previous experience, if we're insulin resistant, if we've been in keto before. So somebody like me who's very insulin sensitive, I can have a higher insulin threshold, meaning that my insulin can be a little bit higher and I'll still be breaking down fat, versus somebody who's insulin resistant, they will have to be much more cognizant of their carb intake so that their insulin is suppressed enough so that they can actually start burning their own fat. And so why is that? Well, there's a hormone or an enzyme called hormone-sensitive lipase, which basically is your kind of stopgap. This is where everything stops. So triglycerides are basically the fat storage in our adipose tissue, so that fat that we have. And insulin is probably the strongest inhibitor of this enzyme. So when insulin's around, you're not breaking down your own fat, which makes sense, because why is insulin high? Insulin is high because you have consumed food, probably mostly carbohydrates. So your body is very smart. It's going to conserve energy. You don't need to burn your own fat because you have plenty of food on board. This is going to be inhibited. Epinephrine, which is one of our main stress hormones, which we can kind of modify based on some biohacking that we do, actually is one of the more important triggers to turn this on. But the really strongest one is suppression of insulin. So if you suppress insulin, this turns on and you start breaking down your own fat, something called glycerol or free fatty acids. So the glycerol basically goes back to your liver and it's converted back into glycogen stores through a process called gluconeogenesis. And you'll hear this online, people talking about gluconeogenesis as if it's something that gets turned on and off. It's something that is always happening in our body. And this has been shown quite impressively by a researcher named Dr. Cahill, who did starvation tests where back in the 40s they were able to do research studies that right now would not pass any ethical board, but they would allow people to fast, they would hook them up to insulin, and they would see how low they could drop their glucose levels. And their glucose levels would kind of bottom out or in the 30s, and part of that they thought was due to this continuous glycerol breakdown, which allows for glucose to be supplied to the brain. But the other part that's important is the free fatty acids, which are then transported, converted somewhat in the liver to ketone bodies, and that's why you hear ketosis. But most of our organs actually use the free fatty acids for energy, not the ketones. The brain is unable to really use most fat stores, and so it'll use ketones for energy. And that's why you'll see people who are on a ketogenic diet really focusing on that number. But over time, if you've been doing it for a long period of time, you become much more efficient at using those ketones, and so you may not produce as many on a blood stick. So basically, to recap, when you are suppressing your insulin level enough, meaning that you're not consuming carbohydrates, so you're not having a huge insulin spike, your protein is in moderate, and most of your caloric intake is from fat, you are suppressing your insulin enough to actually burn your own fat. So a couple studies have looked at inflammation, and these are some of the common inflammation markers that we look at: TNF-alpha, IL-1, different categories, and some prostaglandins, and looking at what happens when you have high levels of insulin. Because we think of insulin now as a main driver of this chronic inflammation, which is causing a lot of microvascular disorders and a lot of the chronic diseases we're seeing. So this study looked at what happens if you've been on a on a high glucose diet after 4 weeks, and you'll see significantly elevation in all the pro-inflammatory markers versus a ketogenic diet, which is much less. And so let's look a little bit about what is biohacking. And so biohacking is becoming a little bit more popular lately, and so it's also got a kind of a bad rap in the sense that there are some people in Silicon Valley, mostly, who are doing some weird stuff. So do you have to drink young, or do you have to inject young people's blood to be a biohacker? Anybody? Yeah, anybody up for that? No? This I don't understand this one. So the idea is that if you are taking younger people's blood, you're going to have stem cells, and you're going to have a chance to live to 150. There is one company in Silicon Valley that has the ability to do this on a small scale because they're a nonprofit and they get blood from the blood banks, but I don't think this is going to be a viable business. But I don't know. Other people are implanting microchips. So anybody up for implanting a microchip? No? All right. We have the recovering biohacker in the back, so maybe you've done that before. With the idea that a lot of the data that we're trying to accumulate and make sense of can be done in a microchip format. I personally probably wouldn't do that. Anybody want to be a human cyborg? So these two people actually implanted sensors. So this guy, anytime there's a smell, he doesn't have to smell it. He can get it directly from this kind of receptor, and it goes directly to the part of the brain that senses smell. So there's definitely an extreme version. And so when you tell people, you're kind of into biohacking, a lot of times eyes glaze over or you get the eye roll. And I think it's probably from some of the things that you read about online. My perspective for biohacking is a little bit different, I think, than a lot of people who are really pushing it. Mine is more of a way back to ancestral living, which I think may apply to people here living in Tahoe and being surrounded by natural beauty, by being outdoors, and not so much this kind of lack of beauty. So let's talk a little bit. I mean, if you're up for that, go for it, but please don't call me and ask me questions. So we talked a little bit about nutrition, and granted, this is an hour or so, 45-minute talk, so it would take probably a month just to dive into why keto works much better than a lot of things. But as I mentioned initially, for a lot of people, if you are relatively healthy, you can get away with low carb or paleo or primal or whatever, even vegetarianism to some degree, as long as you're really focusing on high quality real food. But I wanted to talk about exercise and the impact on insulin. So again, if you remember back, our goal is really to suppress insulin for the most part, not all the time, but to suppress it as much. And so this study looked at elderly people who were sedentary, and what happens after just one exercise session, which is 30 minutes just walking. And so a couple things to take away from it was, over time, what is the plasma insulin doing? And so these are the people who didn't do anything. This is the group that did 30 minutes, and this is the group that did 45 minutes. And then the area under the curve is really the most important, which is how much change are you getting from just simple walking around the block for a little bit you are definitely going to suppress insulin to some degree. And so a lot of people ask me the question, well, I can't run a marathon or I can't do triathlons. What is it that I can do? And the simple answer is do anything that you can. So whether it's walking around after dinner or taking the stairs and descend the elevator, you will get some benefit from that. And the same thing happens with glucose, which makes sense. So just stimulating your muscles increases energy demand, and so overall glucose levels will stay a little bit lower, which is again what we want. This study was continuous. So I think any ability to move, if it means 5 minutes at a time, I think would be beneficial. Yeah. You can, sure, yeah. Yeah. So great question. So insulin is not something that you can test, at home. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's a very unstable protein. The way that they would have to do it is probably eventually it'll come out, but it's not going to be there for a while. Even the one that you do at a LabCorp or a Quest, a blood test, is not necessarily 100% accurate because there's a lot of variables for it. I think probably one of the best kind of indicators that's indirect will be something called a GKI score, and you can get that on Heads Up Health. Basically what that is a ratio of glucose to insulin, or to ketones. And so it gives you an idea, ketones are going to be higher, glucose is going to be lower. You can infer that your insulin is going to be lower. Okay, so, but what happens if you are living in Tahoe and you're going to go ski for, 5 hours and then give a talk? Probably should have thought of that before. Feeling that one. And so what happens to, if you do a little bit more intense exercise? And so this study was a HIIT, basically 30 minutes of high intensity training. What can you expect from insulin? And so the bottom one is going to be those who did HIIT versus the ones who didn't, and you can see a significant decrease. So the reason that, in the ketogenic community, a lot of people will say, all you have to focus on is food. I disagree with that because there's a couple ways that you can improve insulin. One is to reduce the amount of insulin that you need. The other one is to increase the amount of glucose that's going to the muscle, and that'll drive insulin sensitivity to be much better. And so same thing with glucose. What happens, over a 16-minute period, you'll see plasma glucose will be much lower because you're burning that glucose for energy in the muscle. So Mike said he was an endurance athlete. You might like this one. And I know Dr. Finney spoke here, but so the FASTER study actually looked at what happens if you're ketogenic or low carb and you're an endurance athlete. Can you actually improve your ability to burn fat as fuel? And so a lot of studies prior to this that looked at ketogenic athletes or individuals didn't allow them to be keto adapted for a significant amount of time to where they were using fat preferentially for energy. And so what they did is they took two groups, and these were elite athletes, top 10% of their age group, doing either marathons or triathlons, and they split them up into a high carb group and a low carb group. And a lot of studies will look at low carb versus high carb, and if you actually dig into the study, it just doesn't make sense. The low carb group usually has a pretty high carb intake. So their study was very, very accurate in terms of making sure that the ratios would apply to somebody who's ketogenic. Then they put them, through a rigor of blood tests and DEXA scans to measure their body fat. They put them on a 3-hour treadmill run that was about 65% of VO2 max, so not excessive. And then they recovered. All the while they were getting blood drawn and muscle biopsies. Must have been fun. Imagine running on a treadmill and getting biopsies. And the question became, what actually is the preferred fuel source for those of us who are keto adapted? And so what happens to fat oxidation? So in the bottom, this is the low carb group, the high carb group, and this is the low carb group. So we're looking at what actually is the fuel source that people are using. And if you are low carb and you've been fat adapted, you actually preferentially use fat as your fuel. Up to about 88% of the fuel is derived from your own fatty tissue, and versus the high carb group, which use mostly glucose and glycogen stores. They also looked at what happens with carbohydrate oxidation, and again, it would make sense that the group that is high carb is going to use mostly carbohydrate as their basis of fuel, versus the low carb group, which is really going to be using fat preferentially. And so if you can combine a ketogenic kind of lifestyle, low carb, high fat, and some sort of endurance training or HIIT training, you can definitely improve your insulin sensitivity and lose weight much faster. But they also looked at what happens to plasma glucose, and interestingly enough, not much change between the two groups. The same, pretty standard, except for high carb group post recovery had a bump, and that's from carb intake. And then they also looked at what happens to their insulin. And so during rest, insulin is much higher in the high carb group. Low carb group really doesn't have a significant spike. This is due to recovery, which is when they're being fed again. And so if you can improve glucose and insulin, that's going to be an extremely important way to improve your overall health. There's other things that I mean, I think if you're around 2 units is about the lowest I've seen, 1.5. I mean, so again, when you're looking at insulin, if it's a fasting insulin test that's done in the morning, you really want to see something that's less than 40. For most people, as a society, I would say that. For people who are really focusing on being low carb or ketogenic, less than 5. I think 2 is around what I normally run. As far as glucose, I mean, the lowest that I've seen is in the 30s. Most docs here would say that if they saw that, they would put somebody in the ICU on a glucose drip. Well, I mean, normal would be anywhere between 60 and 100. Again, I mean, I think anybody who is under 60 in a medical setting would be put in the hospital. I would say that a lot of our understanding of health is based on the idea that carbs are the main fuel source for individuals. And so now that we're understanding a little bit more that fat can be used as fuel, ketones can be used as fuel, it's changing the idea of what's normal. I think for a society, I would say anything less than 60, the doctor would probably put them in the hospital setting. Yeah, so the question is, what about glycemic index as an outcome marker, basically? I don't think so, yeah. So the glycemic index is a good way of measuring, against a standard known amount that's going to raise your insulin, your blood sugar a certain amount. What are different foods and how are they going to impact it? I think to a degree, it's okay. So obviously, things that are a lot higher in glucose will cause a much higher glycemic index. The problem with the glycemic index is it doesn't account for fructose. And this actually drove a big issue for diabetics because they found that, okay, if foods don't increase glycemic index, it must be okay. And so diabetics started getting fed a significant amount of fructose, which can actually cause a significant amount of insulin resistance, specifically in the liver. And so a lot of the foods that we eat, which are packaged, combine the two together. And so you get insulin resistance in the liver, peripheral insulin resistance, and so it's a double whammy. So I would say, to answer your question in a long-winded version, if you're going to use it with the understanding that you're going to combine it with protein and fat, and you want to stay away from the high glycemic foods, then I think it's probably a good tool to use, knowing that it must not contain fructose as a predominant fuel source. Yes.
And then that falls versus when you're exercising,
Yes.
say, during or I don't know, plus or minus 5 minutes of exercise, you don't get that spike, correct?
So in your example, if you're eating the same thing,
Right. Say I ate maple syrup, when I'm sitting around at my desk, versus you can get it in a solid form.
I'm just, hey,
Versus
whatever works.
in the middle of exercise,
Yeah.
then
So correct. So yeah.
then you wouldn't expect.
I mean, there's many variables that are going to impact whether or not you're going to have an insulin spike to that degree. So the whole point of the exercise component is that if you're needing fuel, whether it's glucose-based or fat-based, you're going to preferentially use that. And so the insulin spike will not be as much because that circulating glucose in your bloodstream will be being used for energy.
So if that's the case, then
Yep.
that would would seem to negate the desire for an endurance athlete to want to use like these super big carbs, like super starch. I mean,
Right.
Like if you're exercising anyway.
Well, I think it depends on what your kind of fuel source is. So if you are glucose-based and you're an endurance athlete, then you probably need that continuously. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, I was a weekend warrior triathlete, and I was hooked on those things. So if I wasn't on some sort of gel, drink, bar, you name it, I mean, I would be like a military guy with those things strapped on me. It was pathetic. And it didn't help either. I sucked. But if you're, we can say that, okay? Yeah, okay. So if you're that glucose-based, then yeah, I think it would make a difference. If you're ketogenic-based, and that's kind of the point of the faster study, is that you are now switching over to what fuel source you're using, and so you don't rely on those things. You don't need them. Yeah, and that's a pretty common question. So at what point are you burning fat that you consume versus burning your own fat? So the whole kind of conundrum of why would you be burning your own fat, or why would you be eating fat if your whole goal is to burn your own fat? And I think it's a topic of contention, especially in the ketogenic world. So a couple things, and the way I'm going to approach it, I think some people would have an argument against it. In the keto community, there's this idea that you can eat as many calories as you want, and that calories don't matter. And I think that's a wrong way of approaching things. And so calories matter in the sense of how they affect hormonally. Are they going to cause a significant insulin response? Are they going to be fructose-based, and they're going to cause insulin resistance? Or are they, real food? When you eat fat predominantly and protein with it, a couple things happen. You get control of different hormone signals, leptin and ghrelin, and there was another one that was up here which is called incretin, which really controls your hunger levels. So on a net scale, you're consuming less calories than you would have if you're carbohydrate-based, where you're always hungry. So if you, as a younger individual, were to calculate your kind of resting metabolic rate, let's say it's something like 2,500 calories. Let's say now you're a runner and you run 5 miles a day. So your total energy expenditure for the day is going to be higher. Let's say 3,500 calories. Now to eat 3,500 calories worth of fat is hard to do. And people can do it, trust me, but it's hard to do. You get full. And so let's say you consume less than that 3,500 calories, maybe 2,500 calories. Well, you got to get that energy from somewhere else. And that's, if your insulin is suppressed enough, that energy is going to come from your own fat stores. So it depends on what your goal is. Let's say you are trying to lose, 200 pounds. Well, then you probably shouldn't be eating 4,000 calories a day, and you probably won't need to because your hunger levels are going to be controlled. And that's really, I think, the benefit over a lot of the other kind of fat diets out there.
So you touched on some of the aspects it comes up in the community, that people that are critical of the keto style diet, they say that you just can't lose fat if you're not eating in a deficit. So with the primary goal of weight loss in mind, what's your opinion on that, the deficit conversation? Because you'll also hear people, like you mentioned, in the ketogenic community saying you can eat as much fat as you want and still lose weight.
Right. And that's kind of the individual response. Is that, it depends on the individual. So let's say somebody like yourself, you don't need to lose weight, you're very active, your total energy expenditure is going to be much higher. And so you could probably get away with, eating higher percentage of your calories as fat or protein. I tend to stay away from calories in general because I think part of the benefit of being keto is you remember again what it means to feel full. And so I think a lot of us who are on kind of the Western cycle are always hungry. We always have that signal that we're hungry because we're hypoglycemic or insulin has gone up, so we're hungry. When you go keto and you go for long periods of time where you're not hungry and then you get that signal that I'm hungry, that's your indication to eat again. And so I think eating to satiety is kind of the goal for most people. If you're trying to just maintain, then you probably don't have to focus on calories at all.
I'm kind of jumping all over the place. It's just in kind of relationship to what Helen was asking. If you're keto adapted and you're doing an endurance event, let's say like a half Ironman or something, do you have any thought, when you're like on a carb diet, well, you're going to take 2 pills every hour and have a shot block or whatever. And I haven't been able to find any, it's kind of all anecdote. Do you have any thoughts on, fueling? I mean, obviously for shorter events, it's really not important.
To a point where you get anaerobic, especially if you are doing endurance sports like that. As far as research, there's not a lot of good research to support either way. I would say for myself, I do a lot of half Ironmans and half marathons. I will definitely get to a point where I'm very much keto, but I'll hit a wall. It's not similar to the kind of glucose-based wall where you just can't move anymore. It's just kind of a lethargy. And so in those situations, what I do is I'll use exogenous ketones at MCT as a fuel source. And so instead of the sugary drinks, I'll put that in my sports drink. And that tends to help. But that's not research-based, that's anecdotal-based, but it works. Maybe it's a placebo effect. Yes?
So I have a question about, I totally can understand the benefits, but in terms of planning, both an individual day of eating, do you track then, what do you do? Because I feel like there's just so much out there in terms of this tracker and that tracker. Do you track macros then? Do you work out your fat, your protein? How do you go through a day?
Yeah, again, it depends. Me personally, I don't track because I've been doing it for so long. I know. I would say for most people who are starting, I think having a macro calculator is a good idea. And there's the one that I would recommend is Chronometer, which is a free one. And it ties into Heads Up Health Chronometer. I'll write it down afterwards. I think initially it's a good idea just to have an understanding of trying to keep your macros within a certain ratio. I think there's too much focus on macros in general. And so I've heard a lot of people who will tell me, I ate an extra 200 or 300 calories of fat at night because I hadn't hit my macros. That's probably the stupidest thing you could do. So I think, we have to take this and think kind of outside the box. Have a good guide, but it doesn't have to be exactly perfect. If you're full, you don't need to eat more. I think that's a good start. Then getting a good book that gives you an idea of what foods you can eat, what foods you can't eat is a good start. I think unfortunately there's a lot of people out there promoting their version of keto, this version, whether it's it's been bastardized so many different ways, so it's hard to know what the good information is. So feel free to ask me afterwards, and I'll give you some good resources. Sorry, any other questions? Okay. Spirits going on. Yeah. All righty. So, again, we were talking a little bit about biohacking. So hopefully nobody's asleep at this point. But one of my favorite topics to talk about as it relates to health is sleep. And because I think now it's becoming recognized the impact of sleep or lack of sleep on a host of different issues. But interestingly enough, there's also a lot of research that's looking at our normal circadian rhythm. And so if you live, let's say, up here, and it's a sunny day, and you wake up when the sun rises, your body prepares itself to wake up by basically starting to increase cortisol. And cortisol is our main kind of stress hormone, let's think of it that way. And the other hormone that's very important as far as sleep goes is melatonin. So melatonin at night is going to start rising, cortisol is going to start going down, and then in the morning, the opposite is going to happen. Around 3, 4 in the morning, cortisol is going to go up, and your melatonin is going to start going down. That's a normal process. Unfortunately, a lot of us are negatively impacting cortisol and melatonin, and so we're not getting a good amount of sleep. And when you don't get a good amount of sleep, that has significant impact on the next day. I'm sure my ER doc knows about not sleeping, or anybody who's had little kids knows what happens when you're not sleeping and how you feel the next day. But there's an actual physiological process that's going on. But if we actually look at kind of reporting data of what people think as far as their sleep patterns, so very few really say, oh, I had hardly any sleep or too little. Most would say, yeah, just about enough. And so this is based on age. So younger individuals, 54, older, 63. But most people don't know what is enough sleep. So unless you're tracking sleep data, you really don't know. And so why is it important? Well, if you're not getting good sleep, and when we talk about good sleep, we talk mostly about deep and REM sleep, significant metabolic processes happen. And so if you have a bad night's sleep, the next day your serum cortisol level is going to be higher. And this is not significantly effective, but it will be higher. And why is that important? So that cortisol is basically your stress response. And that's going to increase glucose basically in the bloodstream to allow for use of your muscle. What happens though, if you've had one bad night of sleep, that cortisol remains elevated for up to 36 hours. And if you continue to have bad nights of sleep, you continue to have an elevated cortisol, which is going to impact insulin and insulin resistance. And so you get in kind of this vicious cycle where you have high cortisol, so it affects your sleep. You're not getting deep sleep, which again, it affects your cortisol, which makes you more stressed, so you eat more, so your cortisol goes up. And so it's really important to get out of that vicious cycle. And to do that, it's pretty simple. You want to get this cortisol under control, and you want to have melatonin coming up at night. So what are the main things that block melatonin? Anybody know? Especially at night? Blue light, yeah. So blue light is going to be the main one, but also not getting enough sunlight during the day. A couple other things that really affect melatonin are going to be eating late at night. And so there's new research that's looking at the pancreas itself actually makes melatonin. And so if you eat late at night, so drinking alcohol, eating late at night, being on your iPhone is going to significantly impact melatonin, so you don't get deep sleep. Next morning, your cortisol is going to be much higher, so you're going to be angry, you're going to be hungry and angry, and then you kind of get into this vicious cycle. And so is there a cost associated with this? And there is. And in the United States, we far outpace any other industrialization as far as the amount of GDP. So this is $411 billion in 2017 in terms of the cost to our GDP. So there is a cost. So what can you do? So, we talked about not eating late at night, but other stress reduction techniques can have an impact on glucose and insulin. So one of my favorite ones recently that I've been talking about is meditation. And when you hear meditation, when you start talking about meditation, most people just go blank or roll their eyes. But there's actually been studies that have looked at what happens to cortisol by doing meditation. And so this was a study that looked at two groups. One did transcendental meditation and one did nothing. And over an 8-week period, saw a pretty significant decrease in their cortisol, so almost 25%. And so what's the impact on glucose? In the study, just by doing meditation, not changing anything else, their fasting glucose decreased by 5 points, which is pretty significant. And postprandial glucose, which is also an important indicator of how insulin is functioning, also decreased about 8%. And so these are normal, healthy people that were doing this. But then cardiologists wanted to look at, is there a better way to treat people who have cardiovascular disease? So they took two groups. One group got health lecture on how to be healthy, how to improve their health. And then the other group actually had meditation. This is for a 16-week course. And so you'll see their glucose level. On the left, this is going to be the people who actually did meditation. These are going to be the people who actually did just the health course, basically telling them how to be healthy. And you'll see a significantly decreased glucose level versus an increase. And there is no change in terms of the different groups as far as their eating pattern, sleeping patterns. They basically stratified it so that they were equal. Same thing with insulin. So just doing meditation significantly decreased their insulin versus the people who just had health coaching actually. And then something that we haven't talked about but is also important is something called HOMO-IR, which is a measurement of insulin resistance, indirect influence. And so the guys who did meditation saw a decrease in the HOMO-IR score versus the group that did just health education. And so again, this cost of stress is probably one of the most significant on our economy in general. So it's estimated, and this is from 2016, that 1 million workers will miss work due to stress, which is pretty significant. And that goes to about $600 per employee per year. Those who actually report that they were stressed, they have 46% higher healthcare costs. And the cost is about $150 billion per year, just from stress-related illnesses. Yeah.
Increase of insulin and glucose from the meditation practice. Do you know if that was a result of the breath work and oxygenating the body, or was it a mental mindset?
Yeah, it's more of a mental mindset. And so you're decreasing cortisol, which is decreasing insulin. Oh, yeah.
Thoughts are on taking melatonin as a sleep aid?
Yeah, great question. I tend to avoid all external medications, even something like melatonin, unless necessary. As you get older, melatonin obviously decreases production. I think if you have done everything as far as trying to improve your sleep hygiene, so make the room dark, not be on devices, make it cold, things like that, and you're still not sleeping very well, I would say melatonin over something like Ambien or another kind of sleep aid, which don't work. So a couple other things that just, I know we're kind of running a long time, but other things that you can do to improve glucose absorption, insulin sensitivity would be to do sauna. We did one yesterday after a ski session, and that was pretty awesome. And just showing that over time, if you do it enough, you'll see a significant decrease in your glucose, and insulin will be suppressed. So they've actually looked at this. I'm going to go a little bit faster just based on time, but is if you do sauna versus no sauna, what's the impact on glucose? And these are the people who are in the sauna. You'll see a significant decrease versus people who are not. And that just makes sense. If you think about it, you're in a hot environment, your metabolic activity is higher, so you're going to burn glucose much higher, so it's not going to go up as much. And this kind of came out blurry, but other benefits of sauna, you're going to decrease inflammation, which is going to measure by CRP. It's going to improve blood flow, so you're going to have improved nitric oxide, less chance of having heart disease, and improvement in blood pressure. Yep. Yeah. So there's, dry sauna, wet sauna. Now there's far infrared. Really the goal is the temperature point. So if you can raise your core temperature, that's where you're going to start seeing the benefit. I tend to feel like the far infrared for myself work better, just because you're heating from internally, and there might be some benefit for the mitochondria, but in general, keep your temperature up, you should be okay. Yep. Yeah, so in general, it depends on how hot it is. It depends on your experience. And so I would say goal would be 19 minutes. That's what the studies look at as far as the cardiovascular benefit. 19 minutes 4 times a week is really what they study. Well, enough to raise your core temperature by like 1.5 to 3, but most of them are going to be, if it's wet, it's going to be like 130. If it's a dry sauna, about 170. If it's an infrared, about 100.
Hot tubs.
Yeah, hot tubs don't work, unfortunately. No. You're not getting your core temperature high enough, unfortunately. So they've done studies where they've looked at certain parameters like nitric oxide production, which will dilate your blood vessels. It's like the Viagra for the body. And those studies will show that, yeah, if you're in a hot tub, you'll get some benefit of that. But you're not going to get a lot of the other benefits, which are going to be increased norepinephrine, increased dopamine, things like that. So, I saved this one for last because a lot of people stop listening to me when I talk about jumping in the ice. And the reason that it's important is because, sorry, I know I keep walking in front of you, is there's something that we have which we thought we lost due to getting older. And when babies are born, one of the reasons that they don't shiver or freeze to death is because they have a different type of fat, which is called brown fat. The reason it's called that is because it's got a lot more mitochondria, and so it looks dark. And so as we get older, we thought, well, we just lose it. But the reality is that it's just dormant because we don't use it. Now, being in Tahoe, you're very lucky because you can go outdoors and activate these brown adipose tissue. And the importance of that is that, think of it kind of like those old school thermostats or the radiators, which gave off heat in the winter. Well, that's essentially what you can create in your own body. And the way you do that is by exposing yourself to cold. And so somebody who's lean but doesn't go out in any like cold environments is not going to see any brown fat, and this is brown fat usually in the truncal area. But somebody who's lean and cold exposed, they're going to have significant amount of brown fat, and that's basically something that's going to be burning energy all day long. But somebody who's overweight and cold exposed has a lot less because their brown fat has been converted to white fat. And then you can convert it back into brown fat. Yeah. Yep. Yep. You get used to it. That's, yeah. So the question was, over time, if you've been exposed to cold, you have less need to really kind of warm yourself up, and that's due to cold adaptation. This is kind of a representation of the way it looks on PET imaging. So this person, it's kind of hard to make out, but they don't have much. If you're in cold weather, you're going to have a lot more perfusion of blood to the brown fat. And then they've also tested it as far as what happens if you stimulate with insulin, what happens to glucose uptake. And so again, if you remember, you're trying to increase the amount of glucose that you're taking up into your muscles to get rid of it. If it's brown adipose tissue and it's exposed to cold, you get a significantly more increase in blood flow, and you get more glucose uptake than if you're just in a controlled environment. Insulin is going to be the most powerful, and so that's why it's always much higher, because insulin, that's its purpose, it's going to drive glucose. And so what happens, a couple things happen when you get exposed to cold. You get increase in these glucose, what are the docs called now? Receptors, basically, that allow for glucose to go into the muscles and tissues. And so you'll get an increase in GLUT4, which is mostly in the muscles, and GLUT1, which is kind of all over, but also in the muscles. And this allows you to drive glucose into your muscles so you're burning fuel much more effectively. And then you produce something called UCP1, which is a protein that goes into the mitochondria, which is the battery of the cell, and it basically dissipates heat, so you're burning energy at a much higher rate. And so this is kind of, from a schematic, what it represents. You get exposed to cold, your brain responds by basically activating your sympathetic nervous system. You get less insulin secretion, and you get improved insulin sensitivity, and so you get this adaptive kind of period where you're using more glucose and producing less insulin. If you combine it with exercise, really your goal is to do a couple things. So you're going to remove fat because you're going to be using it for energy. You're going to have increased energy exposure. There's mitochondrial uncoupling. is this UCP1 that I talked about, is you're going to improve insulin sensitivity and improve your overall metabolic health. We wanted to show you, yep. Don't worry. Talking to me, so that's impressive. So we did 5 minutes. I generally will do about 20 minutes. What was that, March last year? Yeah. It was 47, I think. 48, something like that. We're going to go tonight, actually.
Okay, so 5 minutes.
So I do 20 minutes at about 45 degrees. 5 times a week. The water temperature. I wouldn't recommend doing that. But I've been doing it for a long time, so let's see. I'm swearing usually. No. It's, yeah, cold bathtub does. Yep. I mean, you don't have to go in the lake, but you're here. So. You guys didn't get the email that this is a group? Okay. Yeah, this is a field trip. No? You need to email that out next time. So yeah, cryo does the same thing. So it's really, the whole goal is to drop your core temperature so you get the metabolic response. But cryo is great because it takes you 3 minutes, but some people don't want us to be spending a ton of money on it. So you can go into a natural or your bathtub. Kids love to throw ice on you. So. It's pretty cold, right? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, especially now. So. Oh. So, and then allows you to be burning energy all day. And then it, depending on the timing, it can improve your sleep patterns because it drops your core temperature, so you sleep better. So you improve your cortisol, your insulin sensitivity. Well, yeah. So I would say if you're starting off, don't jump as long as you can put your feet down. I would say a good way to start is do it in your bathtub, doing just the regular water, getting in, and then having somebody come by. So pacing yourself, so do a few minutes at a time, and then kind of building up. And then jumping in the lake. Yeah, so the question is, do you do hot or cold before and after? So most of the studies that come out as far as sauna or cold exposure are going to be from the Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden, and their kind of routine is to alternate hot and cold. And the idea is that you're creating hormetic stress, which is basically a small stressor and your body responds to that. I think you can do either, so you could do sauna or you could do cold. I think it feels better if you go from one to the other. But again, it's one of the issues with biohacking, I think, in our society is how do you do all this stuff and then live your normal life? And I think that's a challenge for a lot of people. And so I try to do them all condensed in a short period of time in the morning before my kids wake up. And so I'll go from one to the other. Well, in general, I do the opposite. So I'll do the hot and then the cold. It makes the cold much more tolerable because you're hot to begin with. Or I'll do it after like a long, training session, so it actually feels better. I would say in general, going from cold to hot, it's pretty hard to do because you're shivering. Even if you're in a sauna, it's pretty uncomfortable. So I would say naturally warming up, warm shower, clothes is usually what I recommend. Well, yeah, I mean, one of the benefits is that you get acclimated to it. Yeah, well, maybe you need to jumpstart it by getting really cold so that everything else feels really warm. Yeah, I think that's, yeah, so there was just two, I wanted to recap it to, what we talked about, how we can address these chronic illnesses so we can decrease the amount of chronic disease that's in our society, so we can improve the cost benefit for businesses, but also for individuals. And you mentioned earlier, Dave is here with Heads of Health. We have some other kind of tracking devices. I'll be out there. Feel free to ask me questions about them. Or if you have any questions, feel free to talk to me. I thought most of us need to have this image tonight since it's been cold. I don't feel bad for you guys. I know a lot of people have been complaining about so much snow. Yeah, I don't feel bad for you. Sorry. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks for coming, everyone. I think Dave and John will be hanging out for a little bit longer, probably out front in the main gathering room. So please stop and ask questions. Check out all of Dave's toys. And thank you for coming tonight.